Thank you for being an incredible supporter of the 10X podcast group, the home of the skillful art of manipulation. We're thrilled to have you as part of our growing community. If you haven't already, we'd love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and help us reach a wider audience with our stories. Plus, with new episodes released every day, your feedback plays a vital role in shaping what we create. It truly makes a difference. Your loyalty and enthusiasm fuel our passion for crafting gripping tales, and we're so grateful for your support. Today, we're excited to present The Blackmailer's Playbook, a story that promises to keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's dive into this thrilling narrative together. Chapter 1: Whispers in the Shadows. They say every town has its secrets, but in Hawthorne, secrets were currency, and I was the broker. At first glance, Hawthorne was a picturesque little bubble. White picket fences, well-manicured lawns, and smiles that stretched a little too wide. But if you knew where to look, you'd see the cracks. Those cracks whispered stories of betrayal, deceit, and desperation, just waiting for someone like me to exploit them. And exploit them I did. My name? It doesn't matter. What matters is that I've always been invisible, a shadow in the background, the kind of person who blends in at every party but is never really seen. People underestimated me because they never thought I was worth noticing. That was their first mistake. You'd be amazed at how much you can learn about people when they don't think you're listening. The idea didn't come to me all at once. Like most acts of sin, it started small, almost innocent. I worked odd jobs around town, drifting from one place to another, always just enough to pay the bills, but never enough to satisfy the itch that had lived inside me since I was a kid. That itch to have more, to be more, to matter. It all began with an envelope. I was cleaning up after an event at the Hawthorne Country Club, a charity gala for some cause no one actually cared about. The rich liked to pat themselves on the back while drinking overpriced champagne and making backroom deals. I wasn't supposed to be there, not really. I was just a temp, hired to serve hors d'oeuvres and clear plates. But as the night wound down and the guests left, I saw it. A plain, cream-colored envelope, half hidden under a chair. I should have walked away. I should have tossed it in the trash and gone home. But curiosity has always been my weakness. The envelope was unsealed, practically begging to be opened. Inside were photographs, explicit photographs. A man, tangled in a compromising position with someone who wasn't his wife. Jonathan Crest. Even if you didn't live in Hawthorne, you knew his name. Crest wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. The golden boy, the mayor's best friend, the head of the local bank. He practically owned this town. Seeing him like that, vulnerable, made something dark stir in me. For once, the mighty weren't so mighty after all. For days, I carried those photographs around, unsure of what to do. Part of me thought about turning them in, exposing him. But what good would that do me? I wasn't looking to be a hero. And then it hit me. If Crest had something to lose, how many others did too? Hawthorne's elite built their lives on appearances. What would they pay to keep those appearances intact? It was a dangerous thought, but danger has always had a way of pulling me in. The first time was a test. I typed out the message on an old typewriter I found at a thrift store. Less traceable that way. The note was short, direct, and designed to terrify. I know what you did. Leave $20,000 in a brown paper bag at the abandoned train station by midnight, or everyone else will know too. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. People like Crest are paranoid by nature, always afraid someone's watching, someone's waiting to take them down. I left the note in his mailbox late one night and watched from the shadows as he found it the next morning. The way his hands trembled as he read it sent a rush through me I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure if he'd actually do it. The abandoned train station had been closed for years, a relic of a time when Hawthorne wasn't just a town for the rich and comfortable. The place was falling apart, graffiti on the walls, weeds growing through the cracks. When I walked in at midnight, I didn't expect to see the bag. But there it was, sitting on the bench, just like I'd asked. $20,000. Neatly stacked, wrapped in crisp bands. I couldn't believe it. The man didn't even hesitate. That's when I realized how much power secrets could hold, and just how much people would pay to protect them. After Crest, it became a game. I started small, listening in on conversations, piecing together whispers into something more dangerous. The town talked and I listened. A business owner cheating on his taxes. A PTA mom having an affair with her kid's soccer coach. A local politician taking bribes under the table. Every secret became a thread, and I wove them into a web so intricate, so tangled, that even I sometimes forgot who I was blackmailing and why. But here's the thing about power. It's addictive. And the more I took, the more I wanted. At first, it was just about the money. Then it became about control. I didn't just want their money, I wanted their fear. I wanted them to lie awake at night, wondering if today was the day their world would come crashing down. I wanted to watch them squirm. Some paid without question, too afraid to risk their reputations. Others tried to fight back, hiring private investigators or threatening to go to the police. But I was always one step ahead. I used burner phones, fake addresses, and drop locations no one would dare approach. I made sure they knew that crossing me wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. And then there was the night of the gala. The gala was Hawthorne's social event of the year, a glittering, gaudy display of wealth and vanity. I didn't plan to work it. I was there as a guest this time, thanks to a little manipulation of my own. I'd forged an invitation and borrowed a dress from someone who'd never notice it was missing. No one questioned me. Why would they? I'd become so good at blending in that even the people I'd blackmailed didn't recognize me. I wasn't there to mingle. I was there to gather more secrets. And oh, did Hawthorne deliver. I overheard a conversation between the mayor and a contractor about a bribe that would make Crest's scandal look like child's play. I watched as a local pastor slipped out of the ballroom with a woman who wasn't his wife. Everywhere I turned, there were cracks and I was ready to pry them open. But as the night wore on, I felt it, a shift, subtle but undeniable. The eyes lingered too long, the whispers grew louder. Someone had noticed me. Someone new. I left early, slipping out through the back and into the cool night air. My heart raced as I walked down the dimly lit street, the envelope of New Intel tucked under my arm. But as I turned the corner, I saw it, an envelope taped to my car windshield, addressed to me. No one knew my name. No one was supposed to. I ripped it open, my hands shaking, and read the single line scrawled across the page. Your turn. Chapter 2, The Game Turns. The envelope on my windshield wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. Whoever left it had invaded my carefully constructed world, breaking through layers of anonymity I had painstakingly built. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control. For the first time, someone had turned the tables on me. I stood there in the dark, my eyes scanning the street for movement, for a shadow lingering too long, for anything out of place. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the streetlights and the distant sound of a barking dog. My hands trembled as I held the note, that single, taunting line echoing in my head. Your turn. I wasn't used to being the prey, and the sensation crawled over my skin like insects. Whoever this was, they had taken the time to study me, to find me, and that meant they knew far more than I was comfortable with. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove for hours, circling the outskirts of Hawthorne, my mind racing through possibilities. Who could it be? Crest? No, he didn't have the guts. The mayor? Unlikely. He was too careful, too insulated by his own web of lies. But someone knew. Someone was watching. By the time the sun began to rise, I had convinced myself of one thing. Whoever they weren't just playing games. They were sending a message. And I needed to figure out what they knew before they had the chance to use it against me. I spent the next few days carefully retracing my steps, reviewing every move I'd made over the past month. I combed through my notes, my burner phones, the places I'd been, and the people I'd targeted. I even revisited the abandoned train station where Crest had left the money, searching for clues I might have missed. But it was no use. Whoever was behind this had covered their tracks well. Too well. The paranoia began to eat away at me. Every glance in my direction felt suspicious, every lingering gaze a potential threat. At the grocery store, I caught myself staring at a man in a business suit for too long, convinced he was following me. At the coffee shop, I spilled my drink when a woman laughed too loudly behind me. My mind was unraveling, and I hated it. But paranoia wasn't my only problem. The fear made me sloppy. I missed a drop-off for one of my regulars, a wealthy widow whose missing donation money I'd uncovered in the bank accounts of her secret lover. She called me in a panic, her voice trembling as she begged for reassurance. I barely managed to calm her down, and even then, it cost me more effort than I was willing to admit. For the first time, I was losing my grip, and that terrified me. The next message came 2 days later. This time, it was slipped under my door, a thick envelope filled with photographs. My photographs. There I was, caught in moments I thought were private, leaving the train station, watching from the shadows as Crest found my note, even walking into the gala with my stolen invitation. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching, they were documenting. And they were good. The note inside was short and to the point, much like my own style. I know what you've done. Time to pay. Pay? For what? The hypocrisy was laughable, really. Whoever this was, they were blackmailing the blackmailer. I should have been furious, but instead, I felt an odd sense of admiration. They were playing my game, and for the first time, I wasn't the one holding all the cards. But admiration didn't mean trust. And it certainly didn't mean I was going to roll over and let them win. I decided to confront the situation head-on. If they wanted to play, I'd show them who the real master of manipulation was. I crafted a response, careful to keep my emotions in check. The note was simple, typed on the same manual typewriter I'd used before. Meet me. Midnight. Train station. It was a risky move, but I needed answers. And if they were bold enough to show up, it would give me the upper hand. The train station was my territory, a place I knew inside and out. Every broken window, every creaking floorboard. It was my sanctuary, in a twisted sort of way. If things went south, I'd be ready. Midnight came faster than I expected. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown weeds and gravel. The station loomed ahead, its silhouette casting jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. I slipped inside, my senses on high alert. At first, the station seemed empty. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the silence. I waited, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. And then I saw it, a figure standing near the bench where Crest had left his money. They were shrouded in darkness, their face hidden beneath a hood. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they tossed something onto the bench, a small, square object wrapped in cloth. My instincts screamed at me not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unwrapped it, my fingers trembling as I revealed the contents. A tape recorder. I stared at it, confused, until the figure finally spoke. Their voice was low, distorted, probably by some cheap voice changer. "Play it." I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. But I knew I had no choice. I pressed the button, and the tape began to play. What I heard made my blood run cold. It was me. My voice, clear as day, laying out my plan to blackmail Crest. Every detail, every calculated move, it was all there, recorded for someone's amusement. I felt the walls closing in around me, my carefully constructed world crumbling under the weight of my own arrogance. "Who gave this to you?" I demanded, my voice rising with panic. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows without another word. I wanted to chase after them, to demand answers, but my legs felt like lead. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The tape recorder was still playing, the sound of my voice echoing through the empty station. I grabbed it and hurled it against the wall, watching as it shattered into pieces. But it didn't matter. Whoever they were, they had the original. And now, they had me exactly where they wanted. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The tape had changed everything. I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. And for the first time, I realized I might not make it out of this game alive. But if I was going down, I was damn sure taking them with me. Chapter 3. Lines in the Sand. I couldn't get the sound of my own voice out of my head. That recording, it wasn't just incriminating, it was a death sentence. If the wrong people got their hands on it, I was finished. Hawthorne's elite wouldn't just come for me legally. They'd bury me, literally and figuratively. My carefully built empire of manipulation was teetering, and I couldn't afford to let it fall. Not now. Not ever. Whoever had that tape was playing a dangerous game, and if they thought they could outmaneuver me, they were wrong. I wasn't about to be outplayed, not in the game I created. But to win, I needed to figure out who was behind this and, more importantly, how much they knew. The next morning, I returned to the train station. By daylight, it looked less sinister but no less abandoned. The graffiti on the walls seemed to mock me, the shattered windows letting in beams of light that illuminated the decay. I retraced my steps from the night before, hoping to find something I'd missed. A footprint, a clue, anything. What I found was far worse. Taped to the wall above the bench where the figure had stood was another note. The handwriting was jagged, almost rushed, as if they'd been in a hurry to leave it. It read, "You're not as clever as you think. Walk away before it's too late." Walk away? From what? They clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. I didn't walk away from anything. I doubled down, I dug in, I fought. But as I stared at the note, a part of me wondered if that was what they wanted, to provoke me, to make me act rashly. If so, it was working. Back in my apartment, I spread everything I had on the table. The photographs, the notes, the remnants of the shattered tape recorder. It felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. I replayed every interaction I'd had in the past month, trying to pinpoint when I might have slipped up. The list of suspects grew with every memory. Crest, the mayor, the widow, the pastor. Any one of them had the motive to come after me, but none of them had the means. Unless someone else was feeding them information. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always worked alone, never trusting anyone enough to bring them into my world. But what if someone had been watching me all along? Someone who knew the game as well as I did, or worse, better. I needed to change the rules. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached out to someone from my past. Her name was Olivia, and she was as close to an ally as I'd ever had. We'd worked together once a long time ago, before I realized the dangers of trusting people. Olivia had a knack for digging up dirt, and if anyone could help me track down my mysterious tormentor, it was her. Meeting Olivia was always an experience. She lived on the edge of town in a decrepit old house that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Inside, though, it was a different story. Olivia thrived in chaos. Papers, files, and old computers were strewn across every surface, creating a labyrinth of secrets. "You look like shit," she said when I walked in, her sharp eyes scanning me. Olivia wasn't one for pleasantries. "Thanks. I need your help." Her eyebrow arched. "You don't ask for help. What's going on?" I handed her the note and the remains of the tape recorder. She studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "This is sloppy work," she said finally. "Whoever they are, they're trying to rattle you." "Well, it's working," I snapped. "Can you trace it?" She shrugged. "Maybe. But it'll take time. Time isn't something I have." Olivia leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the table. "You've made enemies, haven't you? Big ones. This is personal, whoever it is. Just tell me what you find," I said, already heading for the door. I didn't have the patience for her psychoanalysis. "Hey," she called after me. "Be careful. You're not invincible." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I'd built my life on walking the fine line between caution and recklessness, and I wasn't about to stop now. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and desperation. I kept up appearances, going about my usual routine, but every moment felt like a performance. At night, I barely slept, the weight of the tape and the notes pressing down on me like a physical force. And then Olivia called. "I found something," she said, her voice low. "You're not going to like it." I drove to her house faster than I should have, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, she was waiting for me, a grim expression on her face. "They've been following you for weeks," she said, handing me a stack of photos. The images were chilling. Me at the grocery store. Me leaving the gala. Me at the train station. They were grainy, taken from a distance, but they were unmistakably me. "Whoever this is, they're good," Olivia said. "They've covered their tracks, but I managed to trace one of the photos back to a security camera downtown. The footage is weird." She pulled up the video on her laptop, and I leaned in, my heart pounding. The footage showed a figure in a hoodie, their face obscured, placing the envelope on my car. They moved with precision, almost robotic. But it wasn't their movements that caught my attention. It was what happened next. As they walked away, they glanced up at the camera, just for a moment. And in that moment, I saw it, the faintest hint of a smirk, a flash of satisfaction. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew that smirk. It was Crest. The revelation hit me like a freight train. Crest, the golden boy, the man I'd blackmailed into submission. He was the one coming after me. It didn't make sense. Crest wasn't clever enough to pull this off. He was a pawn, not a player. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to add up. Crest had resources. He had connections. And he had every reason to want me dead. But if Crest thought he could outsmart me, he was sorely mistaken. I'd built my empire on manipulation, betrayal, and lies, and I wasn't about to let some spoiled rich kid take it all away from me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about revenge. That night, I made my move. I broke into Crest's office, a sleek, modern space that screamed wealth and arrogance. I'd been there before, back when I was gathering dirt on him, but this time was different. This time, I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for evidence. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Tucked away in his desk drawer was a folder labeled with my name. Inside were printouts of emails, photographs, and notes, everything he'd collected on me. My entire life, laid out in black and white. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the folder was a single piece of paper. A list of names. My name was at the top, followed by a handful of others. People I'd blackmailed, people who'd paid me to keep their secrets. And next to each name was a single word: eliminated. Crest wasn't just trying to expose me. He was trying to erase me. I stared at the list, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was war. And Crest had no idea what he'd just started. Chapter 4. Playing with Fire. The folder in Crest's desk felt heavier than it should have. I stared at the list of names, each one hauntingly familiar. These weren't just random people. These were my targets, the ones I had played, manipulated, and stripped of their secrets. Seeing their names scrawled in Crest's precise handwriting sent a chill down my spine. Eliminated. The word lingered in my mind like a warning, sharp and unforgiving. I wasn't just being watched. I wasn't just being blackmailed. Crest was planning something bigger, something more final. He wasn't coming for my secrets, he was coming for me. For the first time in years, I felt fear clawing its way up my throat. But fear was a weakness I couldn't afford. If Crest wanted to make this personal, so be it. I'd taught myself to survive on manipulation and betrayal, and now, I'd use those same tools to dismantle him piece by piece. But first, I needed to figure out just how deep his game went. The next morning, I set the plan in motion. I started small: Crest's habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities. I'd spent years studying people, learning their tells, their weaknesses. Crest was no different, no matter how untouchable he pretended to be. He was a creature of habit, a man who lived his life in carefully controlled patterns. And patterns could be exploited. I followed him for days, watching as he moved through his world of power and privilege. Meetings at the bank, lunches at the country club, late-night visits to his mistress's house. He thought he was untouchable, but he wasn't nearly as careful as he believed. It didn't take long to find the cracks. The first crack came in the form of a woman named Vanessa. She was young, beautiful, and utterly unaware of the danger she was in. Vanessa was Crest's mistress, a college dropout who worked as a waitress at a high-end restaurant downtown. Crest had been funding her lifestyle for months, paying her rent, buying her gifts, keeping her quiet. But there was something Vanessa didn't know, something Crest had been careful to hide. Vanessa wasn't the only one. It was easy to find the others. Crest's arrogance made him predictable. He had a type: young, vulnerable, desperate for attention. There were 3 women in total, each one a carefully kept secret. He'd used them, discarded them, and moved on without a second thought. But secrets like that didn't stay buried for long. Not when I was digging them up. I approached Vanessa first. She was sitting alone at a cafe, sipping an overpriced latte and scrolling through her phone. She didn't notice me until I sat down across from her, my presence abrupt and intrusive. "Vanessa, right?" I said, smiling just enough to put her at ease. Her eyes widened, a mixture of confusion and suspicion flickering across her face. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," I said, leaning in closer. "But we have something in common. Jonathan Crest." Her face paled, and I knew I had her. Vanessa wasn't used to being confronted like this, and the fear in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just a pawn in Crest's game, she was a liability. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "Of course you do," I said, sliding a photograph across the table. It was one of the many I'd found in Crest's folder, a picture of the 2 of them, caught in a moment of intimacy. "You've been seeing him for months. And trust me, you're not the only one." Vanessa stared at the photograph, her hands shaking. "What do you want?" "I want the truth," I said, my tone firm. "About Crest. About what he's been telling you. About what he's planning." She hesitated, her eyes darting around the cafe, as if she was afraid someone might be listening. "I don't know anything," she whispered. "He doesn't tell me anything." "That's not good enough," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "If you want to protect yourself, you'll tell me everything you know. Because if you don't, Crest won't be the only one you have to worry about." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But pity wasn't going to get me what I needed. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Vanessa, listen to me. Crest is dangerous. He's using you, just like he's used everyone else. But I can help you. I can protect you. You just have to trust me." It took a moment, but finally she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll tell you what I know." What Vanessa told me wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. Crest had been watching me for weeks, collecting evidence, preparing to make his move. But he wasn't working alone. He had someone on the inside, someone feeding him information. Vanessa didn't know who it was, But she'd overheard enough to know that Crest wasn't acting out of revenge. He was acting out of fear. "He's scared of you," she said, her voice trembling. "He says you're dangerous, that you've been blackmailing people for years. He thinks you're going to destroy him." I couldn't help but laugh. The idea of Crest, the golden boy of Hawthorne, being afraid of me was almost comical. But the fear in Vanessa's eyes told me that this wasn't a joke. Crest wasn't just afraid, he was desperate. And desperate people were the most dangerous of all. Armed with Vanessa's information, I began to dig deeper. I tapped into my network, calling in favors, bribing informants, and piecing together the puzzle. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Crest's inside man wasn't just feeding him information. They were orchestrating the entire operation. Her name was Eleanor Hart. Eleanor was a high-powered attorney who'd made a name for herself defending some of the wealthiest and most corrupt clients in the state. She was smart, ruthless, and utterly devoid of morality. And she had a history with Crest, one that went far deeper than I'd realized. Eleanor wasn't just helping Crest. She was using him, manipulating him into doing her dirty work while she pulled the strings from the shadows. She was the real mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the entire campaign against me. And she wasn't just planning to expose me, she was planning to destroy me. But Eleanor had underestimated me. She thought she was untouchable, just like Crest. She thought she could manipulate me the way she'd manipulated everyone else. But she was wrong, because I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to burn her world to the ground. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the pieces of the puzzle spread out before me. Crest, Eleanor, the list of names, everything was falling into place. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about power, control, and revenge. I picked up the list of names, my eyes scanning the familiar faces. These people had paid me to keep their secrets, to protect their reputations. But now their secrets were the key to my survival. If Crest and Eleanor wanted a war, I was more than willing to give them one. But this time, I wasn't just playing to win. I was playing to destroy. And I wouldn't stop until everyone who had crossed me was left in ashes. Chapter 5: Tearing Down the Tower. Revenge isn't just an action, it's an art form. It demands precision, patience, and a willingness to embrace the darkest parts of yourself. I'd spent years honing that art, perfecting the subtle balance of manipulation and destruction. But now the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Crest and Eleanor had turned my own weapons against me, and if I wanted to survive, I needed to do what I did best: tear their lives apart, one thread at a time. It wasn't enough to expose their secrets. That would have been too easy, too clean. No, I needed to make them feel it, the way I had felt it. The fear, the helplessness, the constant gnawing anxiety that comes with knowing someone is always watching, always waiting to strike. I wasn't just going to destroy them, I was going to make them beg for it to end. I started with Crest. He was the weaker of the two, the easier target. His arrogance was his greatest flaw, and I knew exactly how to exploit it. Crest had built his empire on the illusion of perfection. A perfect marriage, a perfect career, a perfect life. But perfection is a fragile thing, and it only takes a single crack to shatter the whole facade. The first crack came in the form of a letter, sent anonymously to Crest's wife, Elizabeth. The letter was simple, direct, and devastating. "Your husband is not the man you think he is." Enclosed with it were photographs, explicit, damning photographs of Crest with Vanessa and the other women he'd been using. I made sure to include just enough detail to leave no room for doubt, but not enough to implicate myself. Elizabeth was the perfect pawn. She wasn't just Crest's wife, she was his moral compass, the one thing keeping him tethered to the illusion of respectability. Without her, he was nothing. I knew she wouldn't confront him directly, not yet. She would stew in silence, her mind racing with suspicion, until it drove her to act. And when she did, Crest's carefully constructed world would start to crumble. While Elizabeth was my opening move, Vanessa was my queen. She didn't know it, but I'd been grooming her for weeks, feeding her just enough information to turn her against Crest. Vanessa was young, naive, and desperate for validation, the perfect tool for someone like me. All it took was a few carefully planted seeds of doubt, and she was mine. "Crest doesn't care about you," I told her one night, as we sat in her tiny apartment. "You're just another pawn to him. The moment you stop being useful, he'll toss you aside." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "But he said he loved me." I laughed, not bothering to hide my disdain. "Crest doesn't love anyone but himself. If you want to protect yourself, you need to stop being his victim and start being his enemy." Vanessa hesitated, her hands trembling as she held her coffee mug. "What do you want me to do?" I leaned in closer, my voice low and soothing. I want you to help me bring him down. Together, we can make sure he never hurts anyone else again. It didn't take much to convince her. Vanessa had been teetering on the edge of betrayal for weeks, and I was more than happy to give her the final push. She started feeding me information, texts, emails, private conversations. Every detail she gave me was another nail in Crest's coffin. But I didn't stop there. I needed more than just information. I needed chaos. And Vanessa was more than willing to provide it. The next step was Eleanor. She was the real threat, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Eleanor wasn't just smart, she was ruthless. She didn't make mistakes, and she didn't leave loose ends. If I wanted to take her down, I needed to think like her, to become her. I started by digging into her past. Eleanor had spent years building a reputation as a high-powered attorney, but no one rises to that level without stepping on a few necks along the way. It didn't take long to uncover her skeletons. Bribed judges, falsified evidence, a handful of cases that had mysteriously disappeared from public record. Eleanor had built her career on corruption, and I was going to use that corruption to destroy her. But digging up dirt on Eleanor wasn't enough. I needed to turn her allies against her, to isolate her the way she'd tried to isolate me. I started with her clients, wealthy, powerful people who trusted her to keep their secrets. I sent anonymous tips to a few of them, hinting that Eleanor was being investigated for corruption. The rumors spread like wildfire, and within days, Eleanor's phone was ringing off the hook with panicked clients demanding answers. While Eleanor was busy putting out fires, I went after her connections in the legal world. I leaked documents to the press, exposing her ties to a bribery scandal that had been quietly buried years ago. The story made headlines, and suddenly, Eleanor was no longer the untouchable attorney she'd once been. Her reputation was crumbling, and with it, her power. But I wasn't finished yet. I needed to force Eleanor and Crest into the open, to make them desperate enough to make a mistake. I orchestrated a meeting between the two of them, using Vanessa as the bait. She sent Crest a message, begging him to meet her at a secluded location outside of town. At the same time, I sent a similar message to Eleanor, making it seem like Crest was about to betray her. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Hawthorne. I watched from the shadows as Crest and Eleanor arrived, their tension palpable. They argued, their voices echoing through the empty space, each accusing the other of betrayal. Vanessa played her part perfectly, feeding their paranoia until it boiled over into violence. Crest snapped first. He grabbed Eleanor by the collar, his face twisted with rage. "You set me up," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You're trying to pin this all on me." Eleanor didn't back down. She was smaller than Crest, but her presence was no less intimidating. "Don't be an idiot," she hissed. "You've been sloppy, and now we're both paying the price." Their argument escalated, the tension reaching a breaking point. And then it happened. Vanessa screamed, and I saw the flash of metal in Crest's hand. He lunged at Eleanor, the knife catching the light as it sliced through the air. Eleanor dodged, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the ground and swinging it at Crest's head. The impact was sickening, and Crest crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Eleanor stood over him, breathing heavily, the piece of wood still clutched in her hand. For a moment she looked around, her eyes wild and panicked. Then she turned and ran, disappearing into the night. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding as I processed what I'd just witnessed. Crest was dead, and Eleanor was on the run. My plan had worked, but it wasn't over yet. I needed to tie up the loose ends to make sure there was no trail leading back to me. As I left the warehouse, a single thought echoed in my mind. This was only the beginning. Chapter 6: The Fall of Giants. Crest's lifeless body was seared into my memory as I slipped away from the warehouse, my footsteps soundless against the cold concrete. The coppery scent of blood lingered in the air, mingling with the dampness of the abandoned space. I didn't look back. There was no need. Everything had gone exactly as I planned. Two giants brought to their knees by their own arrogance and mistrust. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Eleanor might have left Crest bleeding out on the floor, but she was far from finished. A woman like her didn't run. She recalibrated, reloaded, and retaliated. And I wasn't naive enough to believe she wouldn't come for me. If anything, Crest's death had only raised the stakes. Eleanor was dangerous, but desperation made her deadly. If I wanted to finish this, I had to act before she did. Back in my apartment, I stared at the wall of notes, photographs, and connections I'd pieced together over the weeks. Crest's name was crossed out now, a jagged line cutting through the middle of his face. Eleanor's name was circled, bold and aggressive, with arrows pointing to every corrupt deal, every bribe, every dirty trick I'd uncovered. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the one thread I needed to pull to unravel everything. But how do you take down a woman who's built her life on manipulation and lies? How do you destroy someone who thrives in the shadows? I needed to draw her out, to force her into the light where she couldn't hide. And to do that, I had to think like her, to become her. The first move was psychological. Eleanor thrived on control, on being the one who held all the cards. So, I decided to take that control away from her. I started with her network, the judges, lawyers, and politicians who owed her favors. Over the next few days, I sent carefully crafted messages to each of them, pretending to be Eleanor. The messages were subtle but damning. Cryptic allusions to bribes, veiled threats, and promises of silence if they played along. It wasn't long before the paranoia set in. I heard whispers through my informants. Eleanor's allies were starting to question her loyalty, her competence. Some of them began cutting ties, quietly distancing themselves from her before the rumors could become accusations. But it wasn't enough to isolate her. I needed to make her feel hunted. The second move was personal. Eleanor had always been meticulous, covering her tracks and erasing any evidence that could lead back to her. But everyone has blind spots, and Eleanor's was her family. She had a younger sister, Rachel, who lived a quiet, unassuming life in a suburb outside of Hawthorne. Rachel had no idea what kind of monster her sister was, and Eleanor had gone to great lengths to keep it that way. I made sure Rachel found out. It started with an anonymous package left on her doorstep. Photographs of Eleanor at her worst, caught in moments of bribery and betrayal. Along with the photos was a note: "Your sister isn't who you think she is. Ask her about the Carter case." The Carter case was one of Eleanor's biggest scandals, a case she'd buried so deeply that even I had struggled to uncover the truth. But now it was out in the open, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Rachel confronted Eleanor the next day, and the fallout was glorious. Through a well-placed bug in Eleanor's office, I listened as the two sisters argued, their voices rising to a fever pitch. "You don't understand, Rachel," Eleanor snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "Everything I've done to protect us. To protect you. Protect me?" Rachel shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "You've been lying to me my entire life. How is that protecting me?" Eleanor didn't have an answer. For the first time, I heard doubt creeping into her voice, a crack in the armor she'd so carefully constructed. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep me going. The third move was violent. Eleanor had been careful to keep her hands clean, but I wasn't bound by the same moral constraints. I hired someone, an enforcer, a man who specialized in sending messages that couldn't be ignored. His name was Marcus, and he came highly recommended by one of my more unsavory contacts. Marcus didn't ask questions. He didn't care about motives or morality. All he needed was a name and an address, and he'd do the rest. I gave him Eleanor's address along with a simple instruction: scare her. Not enough to send her running, but enough to make her feel vulnerable. The attack happened late at night. Eleanor was walking to her car when Marcus appeared out of the shadows, a hulking figure in a black hoodie. He didn't hurt her, not physically anyway. Instead, he pinned her against the car, his hand gripping her throat just enough to make her gasp for air. "This is a warning," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Stop digging, or next time I won't be so gentle." When he let her go, Eleanor stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus disappeared into the night, leaving her shaken and alone. The next day, I received a message from Marcus: "It's done." Eleanor's fear was palpable now. She was making mistakes, lashing out at her remaining allies, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers. I watched as she unraveled, her once calculated moves becoming desperate and erratic. But I wasn't done with her yet. The final move was the most important. I needed to force Eleanor into the open, to make her confront the consequences of her actions. I leaked the Carter case to the press, along with a detailed account of her involvement. The story spread like wildfire, and within hours, Eleanor was at the center of a media storm. But the real blow came when I sent the evidence to the district attorney's office. They couldn't ignore it, not with the media breathing down their necks. A warrant was issued for Eleanor's arrest, and within days she was hauled out of her office in handcuffs, her empire of lies crumbling around her. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand. They showed Eleanor being led out of the courthouse, her head held high despite the cameras flashing in her face. She looked defiant, unbroken. But I knew better. I knew she was already beaten. Crest was dead. Eleanor was ruined. And I was still standing. But as I stared at the screen, a strange emptiness settled over me. I had won. I had destroyed them, just as they had tried to destroy me. But at what cost? My hands were stained with their blood. My soul weighed down by the lies and violence I'd unleashed. Revenge was supposed to feel satisfying, but all I felt was hollow. Chapter 7: A House of Cards. The air in my apartment felt heavy, suffocating. The whiskey in my hand swirled lazily, amber and venomous. I had won. Crest was dead. Eleanor was disgraced, and the web of lies they'd spun had been unraveled thread by thread. But the emptiness that hung in the air was something I hadn't anticipated. I'd always imagined victory would taste sweeter than this. Instead, it tasted like ash. But I couldn't afford to linger in my triumph, or my hollow regret. Eleanor might have been dragged out of her office in cuffs, but women like her didn't go down quietly. She'd find a way to slither out of her predicament to regain her footing. And I knew, in the deepest recesses of my mind, that she'd come for me. The only way to ensure my survival was to make sure there was nothing left of her to fight back. I spent the next few days working in silence, isolating myself from the outside world. Every detail of Eleanor's life was laid out before me. Her remaining connections, her hidden assets, her legal strategies. She was a survivor, a strategist, and even in shackles, she had more power than most people could dream of. But power means nothing without a foundation, and hers was crumbling. Eleanor's arrest had sent shockwaves through Hawthorne's elite. The whispers were everywhere, at the country club, in the boardrooms, on the streets. Her clients were abandoning her in droves, desperate to distance themselves from her corruption. The press was relentless, digging into every aspect of her career, her personal life, her family. And I had fed them just enough to keep the fire burning. But it wasn't enough. I needed to make sure she never recovered, that her empire didn't just collapse but disintegrated into nothingness. And to do that, I had to go deeper than I ever had before. The first step was dismantling her financial safety net. Eleanor had always been careful, hiding her money in offshore accounts and shell companies. But no one is perfect, and I'd spent weeks tracing her transactions, piecing together the puzzle of her finances. It was painstaking work, but it paid off. I found the cracks, the accounts she'd thought were invisible, the payments she'd made to silence her enemies, the bribes she'd funneled through intermediaries. With the help of a trusted hacker, a man who owed me more than a few favors, I drained those accounts dry. The money didn't go to me. That would have been too risky, too obvious. Instead, I funneled it into charities, anonymous donations that couldn't be traced back to me. Eleanor's wealth, her security, was gone in an instant. Next came her connections. Eleanor had spent years building alliances, cultivating relationships with powerful people who owed her favors. But alliances built on corruption are fragile, and I knew exactly where to apply pressure to make them break. I sent incriminating evidence to her closest allies, proof of the bribes, the backroom deals, the betrayals. It wasn't long before they started turning on her, feeding information to the press and the authorities to save their own skins. Eleanor was alone now, her empire reduced to rubble. But there was one last move to make, one final nail in the coffin. The prison was bleak, a cold, gray fortress that reeked of despair. It was where Eleanor was being held while she awaited trial, her once glamorous life reduced to a cell and a jumpsuit. I knew the warden, a man with a penchant for turning a blind eye in exchange for the right price. It hadn't been difficult to arrange a meeting with Eleanor, though I doubted she'd be happy to see me. When they brought her into the room, I almost didn't recognize her. The sharp, calculated woman I'd once feared was gone, replaced by someone who looked older, weaker. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and drawn. But her eyes, they still burned with defiance, with a hatred so deep it felt like a physical force. "You," she hissed, as the guards left us alone. "You did this." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, the cuffs around her wrists jangling. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" "I know it's over," I said calmly. "Look around you, Eleanor. You've lost everything. Your money, your allies, your reputation, it's all gone. And it's not coming back." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "You don't understand, do you? People like me don't just disappear. You can tear me down, but I'll rebuild. I always do." "Not this time," I said, leaning forward. "Because this time, I made sure there's nothing left to rebuild." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "What did you do?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were documents, photographs, and recordings, everything I'd uncovered about Eleanor's crimes. But it wasn't just evidence. It was a roadmap, meticulously detailing how I'd dismantled her life piece by piece. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I want you to understand," I said, my tone cold and unforgiving. "I want you to know exactly how I destroyed you. I want you to feel it, to live with it, every single day." Her laugh was softer this time, almost sad. "You're just like me," she said, looking up at me. "You think you're better, but you're not. You're a monster, just like the rest of us." "Maybe," I said, standing up. "But at least I'm the monster who won." As I walked out of the prison, the weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks finally began to lift. Eleanor was finished, her empire of lies reduced to ashes. But as I stepped into the cold evening air, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Victory had always been my goal, but now that I'd achieved it, I felt empty. The game was over, the pieces scattered, and yet I couldn't help but wonder if I'd lost something in the process. My humanity, perhaps, or whatever shred of morality I'd once had. But it didn't matter. The world was a game, and I was its master. And no matter how hollow it felt, I wasn't about to stop playing. Chapter 8. Shadows of Retribution. The days after Eleanor's downfall felt surreal, like I was walking through the remnants of a battlefield I'd created. Every piece had been strategically placed, every move calculated to perfection. And yet, the emptiness inside me continued to grow, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't escape. I had always been a predator, circling my prey with patience and precision. But now that the hunt was over, I felt unmoored, drifting in a sea of consequences I hadn't fully considered. Eleanor was gone. Crest was gone. The world I had built for myself was still standing, but it felt fragile, hollow, like it could collapse at any moment. And then the letter arrived. It was slipped under my door in the dead of night, a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. No name, no return address. Just the faint scent of ink and the weight of something ominous. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling ever so slightly as I read the words scrawled across the page. "You think it's over, but it's not. The past has a way of catching up with you." There was no signature, no hint as to who had sent it, but the message was clear. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. And they weren't finished with me yet. I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through every possibility. It couldn't have been Eleanor. She was locked away, her empire in ruins. Crest was dead, his body buried along with his secrets. But there were others. There were always others. Paranoia set in quickly. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every shadow held a pair of eyes. At night, I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, my hand wrapped around the handle of a knife I kept close. The city felt colder, more hostile, as if it had turned against me. I started noticing little things, things that didn't add up. A car parked across the street for hours, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. A figure lingering in the alleyway behind my building, always disappearing before I could get a good look. Phone calls with no one on the other end. It felt like someone was toying with me, pulling at the edges of my sanity. And then the second letter came. This time it was more personal. Inside the envelope was a photograph of me, taken from a distance. I was walking down the street, my head turned slightly as if I'd sensed someone watching. The note that accompanied it was simple, chilling. "You're not as invisible as you think." My heart raced as I stared at the photograph. Whoever this was, they were close, too close. They knew where I lived, where I went, how to find me. And they wanted me to know it. I spent the next few days tearing my life apart, searching for answers. Every drawer, every closet, every hidden corner of my apartment was turned inside out in a desperate attempt to find a bug, a camera, anything that could explain how they were watching me. But there was nothing. Whoever they were good. Too good. My paranoia turned to anger, then to resolve. If someone thought they could play me, they were sorely mistaken. I had built my life on manipulation, betrayal, and violence, and I wasn't about to let someone else use those weapons against me. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. The turning point came one night, when I decided to set a trap. I left my apartment late, making sure to leave the lights on and the blinds partially open. I wanted them to think I was still home, that I was oblivious to their game. But instead of heading to my usual haunts, I doubled back, taking a circuitous route through the city until I found myself perched in the shadows of an alley across the street from my building. Hours passed. The city hummed around me, alive with the sounds of distant conversations and the occasional blare of a car horn. I waited, my breath shallow, my pulse steady. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the kind of deliberate caution that set my nerves on edge. They were dressed in black, their face obscured by a hood, their movements calculated and precise. They approached my building, pausing at the door as if deciding whether to go inside. I didn't wait to find out. I moved swiftly, crossing the street in silence, my footsteps muffled by the damp pavement. The figure didn't notice me until it was too late. I grabbed them from behind, slamming them against the wall of the building with enough force to knock the wind out of them. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. They didn't answer. Instead, they struggled against my grip, their hands clawing at my arms. I pressed them harder against the wall, my fingers tightening around their collar. "Talk," I snarled. "Or I swear to God, you won't walk away from this." Finally, they stopped struggling. Slowly, they turned their head, and for the first time, I saw their face, a young man no older than 25, his eyes wide with fear. He was nobody, a pawn in someone else's game. "Who sent you?" I demanded. "I don't know," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I was just paid to watch you, that's all. I don't know who they are." I stared at him, my mind racing. He was telling the truth. I could see it in his eyes. He was just another disposable piece, a tool for someone else's plan. But who? And why? I released him, shoving him back against the wall. "Get out of here," I said, my voice cold. "And if I see you again, you won't get another chance." He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, disappearing into the night like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. But his words lingered, echoing in my mind. "I don't know who they are." I returned to my apartment, my thoughts spinning like a tornado. Someone was orchestrating this. Someone who wanted me to feel the fear I had inflicted on others. They were using my own methods against me, turning my world into a mirror of the chaos I'd created. And they were winning. I sat by the window, staring out at the city below. For the first time in years, I felt truly vulnerable, like a pawn in someone else's game. But vulnerability wasn't an option. If I wanted to survive, I needed to find whoever was pulling the strings. And I needed to end them. The game wasn't over. Not yet. And if they thought I was going to go down without a fight, they didn't know me at all. Chapter 9. The Last Move. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke. Everything I had done, every manipulation, every betrayal, every calculated move, had led me here. To this moment. But I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hunted. Cornered. And I hated it. The young man I'd caught outside my apartment was a symptom of a larger problem, a pawn in someone else's game. Someone was targeting me, mirroring my own tactics, and using them to dismantle my life piece by piece. They weren't just trying to expose me, they were trying to destroy me. And for the first time in years, I didn't know who my enemy was. But I was determined to find out. I started with the pawn. He might have been a nobody, but even pawns had value. People like him didn't operate in a vacuum. They worked for someone, answered to someone. And whoever was giving him orders was the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. I spent hours combing through my network, calling in favors, bribing informants, and piecing together fragments of information. It was slow, grueling work, but eventually, I found what I was looking for, a name. Or rather, a codename. The broker. It was fitting in a way. This person, whoever they were, had built their empire on secrets, just as I had. But unlike me, they operated from the shadows, pulling strings without ever stepping into the light. They were careful, precise, and utterly ruthless. And they had made a grave mistake by coming after me. Tracking down the broker was like chasing a ghost. Every lead I followed led to another dead end, another false trail. But I was relentless. I had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, and now, I turned those skills inward, using them to unravel the web of lies that surrounded my enemy. The first real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Vanessa. I hadn't spoken to her since Crest's death, but I knew she still had connections to his world. She was reluctant to help me at first, still bitter over the way I'd used her. But desperation made for a persuasive argument, and eventually she agreed. "The broker works through intermediaries," she told me, her voice low and hesitant. "They don't meet people face to face. Everything is done through messages, encrypted accounts, that kind of thing. But there's one person who might know how to find them." "Who?" I demanded. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "Eleanor." The thought of facing Eleanor again made my stomach churn. I had destroyed her life, dismantled her empire, and left her to rot in prison. The idea of going back to her, of asking for her help, felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked for. But I didn't have a choice. If she knew something, anything about the broker, I needed to find out. Arranging a meeting with Eleanor wasn't easy. The prison system wasn't exactly accommodating, and Eleanor herself wasn't eager to see me. But money and persistence have a way of opening doors, and eventually, I found myself sitting across from her in a cold, sterile visitation room. Eleanor looked worse than I remembered. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, still burned with defiance. "You have some nerve," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm not here to trade insults," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "I need information." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my life, and now you want my help? You really are shameless." "This isn't about you," I said. "It's about the broker. I know you've worked with them. I need to know who they are." Her expression shifted, a flicker of something fear crossing her face. "You don't want to go after the broker," she said quietly. "They're not like us. They're worse. Let me be the judge of that." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "You think you're untouchable," she said. "But the broker doesn't play games. They won't just ruin you, they'll erase you." "I'll take my chances," I said. "Now, tell me what you know." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she sighed and leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. "They operate out of a safe house," she said. "It's in the warehouse district near the docks. But be careful. If they know you're coming, you won't leave alive." The warehouse was exactly what I expected, nondescript, industrial, and utterly forgettable. It blended into the landscape of shipping containers and cranes, a perfect hiding place for someone who didn't want to be found. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert, every shadow a potential threat. The door was unlocked, a faint creak breaking the silence as I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil and rust. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and files, the detritus of 100 secrets. It was a treasure trove of information, but I didn't have time to explore. I was here for one thing, the broker. I found them in an office at the back of the warehouse. They were sitting behind a desk, their face obscured by the shadows. A single lamp cast a circle of light over the desk, illuminating the papers and monitors that surrounded them. "You took your time," they said, their voice calm and even. I stepped closer, my hand hovering near the knife I'd tucked into my jacket. "You've been watching me." "Yes," they said simply. "And you've been very predictable." Their calmness unnerved me. They weren't afraid, and that meant they thought they were in control. But control was my specialty. "You think you can manipulate me," I said, my voice low. "But you have no idea who you're dealing with." The broker leaned forward, and for the first time I saw their face. It wasn't what I expected. They weren't old or scarred or intimidating. They were young, no older than 30, with sharp features and piercing eyes. "You think this is about manipulation," they said, their tone almost amused. "This is about balance. You've spent your life tipping the scales, and now, I'm here to tip them back." I took another step forward, my hand tightening around the knife. "You made a mistake coming after me." "Did I?" The broker's smile was chilling. "You've burned so many bridges, made so many enemies. Did you really think no one would come for you?" Their words hit harder than I expected. They were right, I had built my empire on the backs of others, and now, the weight of my sins was crashing down around me. But I wasn't going to let them win. In one swift motion, I lunged forward, slamming the knife into the desk. The broker didn't flinch, their calm demeanor unshaken. "You can kill me," they said. "But it won't change anything. The damage is already done." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" The broker leaned back, their smile widening. "You're not the predator anymore. You're the prey. And the hunt has only just begun." The words echoed in my mind as I left the warehouse, my heart pounding. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in control. And that terrified me. But if they thought I was going to run, they were wrong. I'd spent my life mastering the art of manipulation, betrayal, and violence. And now, I was going to use those skills to do what I did best, survive. The game wasn't over. Not yet.